So we're going on to section 4 of chapter 15 in your world history book, the Reformation in France now. So we're going on to, we'll be talking about the Huguenots, the civil and religious wars there, the 3 weak kings, 9 civil wars, St. Bartholomew's Day massacre, and Henry of Navarre, Edict of Nantes. So we're going to go on. As you see in this picture here, you'll see some of the people of this time. And we'll see, of course, Calvin was French. And we'll go on to Gaspard Coulon and Henry of Navarre and Antoine Bourbon, going on to the Henrys and Catherine de Medici. The Medicis are like totally in control in that time. So anyway, we were talking, this is all of France. Here we'll see, this is Catherine Medici and controlling her son there. I think it was Catherine, her son. She had 3 sons that she controlled in France. The French monarchy, the French kings. The beginning of the Reformation, France was a strong nation with unrestricted monarchies. That means basically the French kings were in charge and control of everything. But the French people had no rights, as England did. In England they had rights, but here they didn't have the Magna Carta. They didn't have rights in France. The French kings had tremendous power over the government and over the economy and over the church. The French kings had such power over the Roman Church that the king was practically a national pope himself. The church and the state were definitely tied together. The Protestants declared that Reformation was not political, nor were they rebels. So basically in France they said, we're not going to rebel, we're not political, and we're not going to be considered a problem for you. But the French monarchy, the French kings, viewed any break with the church, with the Roman Catholic Church, as a threat to its own power and authority. So we're going to have a problem with many religious wars, it seems, in France. The Huguenots. The Huguenots, many French people welcomed the Reformation in. In fact, John Calvin was a Protestant leader, and he remained in France until 1534 when he was forced to flee and went to Switzerland. Calvin's institutes were translated into French so the people could read them, and many French people became Huguenots, French Calvinist Protestants, and they left the Roman Catholic Church. Here's a picture of basically, here's the very wealthy kings and queens here, and the Huguenots pleading to them. The Huguenots increased in number. Despite hostility, they still increased until they were an important minority. They came from all classes, from peasants to lords, but especially strong in the noble class of France. So there were many Huguenots that were wealthy, and they had come into becoming Protestants, if not that, Calvinists, and very much had embraced the Bible and Christianity. In 1500s, nearly half of the nobles in France had become Protestants. So we have France possibly becoming a Protestant nation? Like England? But no way. The Protestant movement was suppressed by the kings. Both Francis I and Henry II took action against the Huguenots and against Protestant France. In 1547 to 1559, there was constant warring and forcing the Huguenots to worship in secret, so they couldn't worship out in public. The Huguenots appealed, of course. In the 1550s, the prisons were full of what? Huguenots, Christians. Despite persecution, they increased in number. In some areas, they grew so rapidly, they took over old Roman Catholic buildings and used them for worship. So you see the Huguenots, they were growing so fast that they even, the Catholic buildings, no one was going to church there, and so they used them. In 1559, French Protestants met in their first synod, which they said was the Assembly of Representatives. They drew up a confession of faith and the rules of discipline. And they composed to address the king. They wanted to address the king for official permission to hold meetings of worship. The Huguenot Assembly carefully pledged loyalty to the king with no political points. They said, we don't want to rebel against the king at all. In fact, we have no political points. We just want to worship on our own. However, the king thought the very act that they were organizing in an assembly was a threat to him. So he thought, well, they're organizing. They're probably going to organize, and they're going to probably rebel. But they were organizing to worship. All they wanted to do was worship on their own, away from Roman Catholicism. I like this. It says murder, money, power, art, meet the Medici family. The Medici family was a very wealthy family that was controlled in the royalty. Remember, we had the Habsburg in Austria, now we have the Medicis, and they are in France and on to Italy. In 1559, King Henry II was mortally wounded in a jousting tournament. And so Henry's the king then, and he's wounded. And this left the three sons, my three sons, each serving king during the next 30 years. And the three sons were under Catherine de Medici, the Medici family. Francis ruled 1 year, 1559 to 1560. Charles ruled, Charles the Ninth ruled 1560 to 1574, 14 years. And then Henry III ruled 1574 to 1589, 15 years. But during this 30-year period, their mother, Catherine de Medici, attempted to rule for them. So she basically was ruling under these three weak kings, or three weak sons. She proved ruthless and unscrupulous to control her own selfish interests. She was very, very controlling as her mother. And factions developed to try to control these weak kings. Weak things, sorry. 9 civil wars happened between 1862 to 1598. That's a lot of civil wars. Civil war means they're fighting among themselves. And the last 4 decades of the 16th century were 9 wars, all in the name of religion. The Protestants were led by Admiral Gaspard de Coligny in 1519 to 1572, and he was a previous military leader. So the Protestants were led by, I'll just call him Gaspard. And then Henry of Navarre, 1553 to 1610, was the ruler of a small independent kingdom in the Pyrenees Mountains between Spain and France. So he was a ruler there. And these two were led by these two. The Guise family led the Catholic forces. The Guise family, as you remember, were the parents in France of Mary Stuart, which basically, when we think of Mary Stuart, we think of Mary Queen of Scots, and we kind of talked about Scotland. Very much a family that was controlling their daughter to be the Queen of England, huh? So here we have pictures of the Admiral here and Henry of Navarre, and we have the Guise family there. And on to the starting of the religious wars here. Catherine de Medici was put forth the Edict of January. Well, let's talk about what is that. Well, France then was caught in the middle, both Catholics and Protestants, and they desired to take over Catherine's Medici's power. Remember, she's very, very focused on herself, right? And did not want her power and her power through her 3 sons to be taken over. She tried to play one side against the other, the Catholics against the Protestants, and kind of playing them to see who, as one becomes one more powerful than the other in France. But she feared the Protestants more, so she put on a feeble peace effort, said, I'm going to give you guys peace. And so she put on together what was called the Edict of January. The edict said that the Huguenots, they were basically the French Protestants that had become Christian. They believed in a Bible of faith and going on through worship and worship in public. So they said, basically saying this edict would say that they could worship in public if they met outside of town and the royal officials could inspect their services. Okay, you guys can worship, but we'll have to inspect your services to make sure you're not saying anything against the kings and queens, which I am basically controlling her 3 sons. And so this was not a matter of acceptance, but convenient. She said, this will be convenient. You guys worship out there and we'll watch over you. But convenience could change from one moment to another moment. At any moment, she could basically attack the Huguenots. Wars and more wars. Beginning in 1562, there were more than 30 years of war. Not civil wars where one region against one other region. There were wars in France, and they were fighting against each other right there in France with the absence of government. There were like roving bands of armed men without any territories, just wandering about, fighting and blundering and shifting leaders that were quickly formed and dissolved. So basically they were just basically not knowing exactly what they're fighting against. The wars wreaked havoc on the towns and the countryside. There was a massive destruction and many lives were destroyed. And neither side to subdue the other, and many truces were made, and then the truces were broken. So these civil wars were characteristically chaotic, huh? Then we have a horrible day, St. Bartholomew's Day Massacre. Just put this down as a test question too. St. Bartholomew's Day Massacre in 1572. They had that unstable January truce, right, by the Queen Catherine. And this episode was the most horrible of what she had done, called the St. Bartholomew's Day Massacre. See, hundreds of Huguenots, Calvinists are Christian believers in the Bible, and had gathered together in Paris to attend the marriage of Henry of Navarre to the king's sister. Remember, Henry was of royalty, so he's considered more of a Protestant king to come to the king's sister. They were going to get married. Catherine was upset, and so she convinced her son, Charles IX, that there was a plot against him, that he needed to stand up against them because it wasn't a marriage, but a plot. But she initiated one of the most brutal acts in history, and this is the St. Bartholomew's Day Massacre. This was the worst massacre in France. August 24th, 1572, Catholic forces attacked the Huguenots while they were in bed. They were in bed thinking they were protected, and they were going to a wedding, in fact. And the violence lasted 3 days. It started in Paris, and Paris became a horrific place of murder, where nearly all the Huguenots were killed in Paris. Admiral Coligny was murdered first, and Henry Navarre, these are their leaders, escaped death only by vowing to change his religion. They captured him and said, we're going to kill you. He said, okay, I'll change my religion. So he was very weak in that matter. And the massacre spread throughout France, and over 100,000 Huguenots or 100,000, that's a huge amount of Huguenots were murdered. The Roman Church gives France a medal. So what happened? And what happened in Italy and Rome with the Pope? A medal was given to commemorate St. Bartholomew's Day massacre of the peaceful Huguenots. They gave them a medal. Songs and thanksgiving in Rome were sung. Yay, we're going to get rid of these Protestants. We're going to get rid of these people that aren't Catholic. Both Pope Gregory XIII and Philip, of course, there's that monster, Philip II of Spain, praised the King of France and his mother for destroying the Huguenots, the peaceful Huguenots. They hoped the massacre was the beginning of a final solution to this Protestant problem. But the massacre only aroused more to become more Huguenots. Despite 100,000 Huguenots dying, 100,000 more would come to Christ through persecution. Persecution in these times only makes the faith stronger. Henry of Navarre. In 1589, King Henry III and Henry of Guise, a Catholic leader who had tried to dethrone the king, were both assassinated. So we have King Henry III being assassinated. That's one of Catherine Medici's sons, and the Catholic leader of the Henry of Guise was who had tried to dethrone the king, were assassinated. 2 assassinations. And then Catherine de Medici, she died. Now what? The crown passed to Henry of Navarre, who was once, remember, was once a Huguenot, but denied the faith so that he could be saved from destruction, so that he wouldn't be martyred. So it passed to Henry of Navarre. Henry was considered Henry IV, and he ruled 1589 to 1610. He was the first Bourbon line of the French kings and the first Protestant king of France. He was Catholic, Protestant, Catholic, Protestant. He would change whichever was convenient, really. Henry's dilemma. During the massacre, he had converted from Protestant to renouncing Protestant or immediate death and said he will all be a Catholic. He declared himself a Catholic. But then shortly after that renunciation, he vowed to be Protestant again. And the majority of the French were still Catholics, refused to accept him as king. But after his coronation, the people of Paris would not admit him to his capital city. So the people of Paris said, if you're going to say that you are Protestants, you can't even come into our city. And that was his capital. So Henry's advisor counseled him to change his religion back to Catholic. So he did. On July 25th, 1593, he renounced Protestant again and said, his saying was, well, Paris is worth a mass here and there. It's worth me going to a mass so that I could go into Paris and not be persecuted. The profession ended the religious wars, of course, because now I didn't know whether Henry was Catholic or whether he was Protestant as that king of France. So they always call Henry the Huguenot prince, even though he was forced to say that he was Catholic twice. The Edict of Nantes. The Edict of Nantes, or Nantes, I would say Nantes is how you say it in French. The Huguenots perceived Henry as a traitor. And so then in 1598, Henry eased their displeasure with the Edict of Nantes, which said that the Huguenots could live in any towns of the districts of France, but could only practice their faith in certain towns. Huguenots were forbidden to practice or teach outside the territories and at the king's court or anywhere in Paris, but they could only have certain towns where they could worship. But they were not to be discriminated against in the colleges or university, or to use the public health facilities or hold public office. The Huguenots were not to be discriminated against. The Edict of Nantes gave them 100 fortified towns with military garrisons. He said, okay, you can go to your own towns and put up your own military. The edict eased tension for just a moment. The Huguenots were in jeopardy. The edict followed the principle of territory toleration, thus it was only a political compromise. It would become unworkable and lead to more problems. So the Huguenots said that they had their own towns, but would this work out? Well, Henry was assassinated. Henry of Navarre was assassinated in 1610. And his second wife he took was Marie de Medici, of all. Marie Medici. And now she would attempt to rule just like Catherine Medici. Now we have another Medici ruling. She was forced to call the Estates General, but there were so many conflicts that she said, get rid of this Estates General. We don't want it, let it go. And it would not be called for another 180 years. Marie de Medici and her young son, King Louis XII. Okay. Control fell into the hands of Cardinal Richelieu. Richelieu that's him. That's what I always say, But anyway, in 1585 to 1642, he ruled through them. He used them as his puppets to rule France, this cardinal who was representative of the Pope. He ruled for Marie and her son, Louis the 12th. And Cardinal Richelieu worked ruthlessly for his own political agenda and increased the power of the monarchy, the king and the queen, to that of Roman Catholicism. So France moved closer to political absolute, that means absolutely the French kings in power, and limited all of the religious freedoms of any church, only the church he wanted. Of course, he was a cardinal of the Catholic Church. The Edict of Nantes was chipped away. So now Richelieu took steps. He wanted to crush the Huguenots altogether. So he amended the Edict of Nantes with the Peace of Alais of 1629. The Peace of Alais. Peace of Alais is kind of weird, but the Huguenots lost their fortified towns, and now they were in peril of losing all of their freedoms under Marie Medici and her son, King Louis XII, under the Cardinal Richelieu.